Hi, I'm Rob Hawker. Welcome to this latest in my series about data flows. So today we're going to explore the differences between the original Power BI data flows and the new Microsoft Fabric Generation 2 data flows. I hope you find it useful. So let's start by just introducing data flows in the original Power BI setup and what they actually do. So in this diagram you can see a hierarchy of the various Power BI artifacts and how they might interact with each other. So we have a data source at the bottom, or a number of different sources, and we might decide that we want to create a data flow to pull in data from those sources and perform some transformations which are going to be common and reused by people over and over again. We might do this for a few different tables of data, and then we might bring it into a semantic model where we'll actually join those tables of data together, build calculations in DAX, so on and so forth. And then finally we might have one or more reports hanging off that semantic model and delivering the charts, visualizations, etc. that we might want before kind of organizing all of this into an app. So in this scenario here, the only purpose of the data flow is to take the data from the source and shape it and use it just in that semantic model. The data flow itself can't be used for anything else. Actually, technically under the covers, the data was saved in a data lake as a CSV file, but you could only access that via semantic models. You couldn't get to it from any other tools or anything like that. So then Microsoft Fabric came along in May 2023, and all these different capabilities came into our familiar Power BI workspace experience. So instead of just having semantic models, data flows, reports, and so on and so forth, we now have all these other things that we can do. So one minute we can be a data engineer, the next minute we can be working as a data scientist, and it's all in the same place. So we have things like lakehouses, things like notebooks. We've got the real-time analytics capabilities, KQL, etc. And we have it all in that familiar Power BI user interface essentially. And all the data is read and written into a Delta Lake that's referred to as one lake, and you can even access that from your machine and pick up files that are sitting in lake houses using the One Lake Data Explorer that you install on your computer. So very powerful stuff. And one of the key things that was released as part of all of this in the Data Factory area was the Data Flow Generation 2. And so it's a complete re-architecting of the data flows capability. It looks and feels very similar, but I know from speaking to Microsoft that the back end is really different, and it's a little bit more resilient in many ways. So actually it's probably a good idea to plan a roadmap to move away from Data Flows Generation 1 and move to Generation 2. However, there are a couple of things that you need to know if you are going to do that. So let's get into this in a bit more detail. So the next thing we have here is just a quick explanation of what Data Flows Generation 2 do. So just like the previous data flows, they connect to the source, they pull in data, you can put any transformations that you might want to put into the data flow and then publish that data flow. But the big difference really is that the data can be saved into various different places. So instead of only being available to the semantic model, it's still available to the semantic model, but you can also save it into the lakehouse, you can save it into a data warehouse, you can save it back into an Azure SQL Server that you might have in your organization, outside of Fabric even, and then you can save it into Custo KQL real-time analytics locations as well. And then, to give an example of this, so you might bring in your data now from a SQL Server database into a lakehouse, and then you might add a Python notebook to that lakehouse, or an R notebook, or a Scala notebook, whatever you choose. And you might do some in-depth statistical analysis, and then you might say, well, I want to write the original data and also the statistical analysis done on top of that data back into a SQL database, and then everybody can just connect to that one SQL database for their visualization. So I put together a table which shows all the differences that I know of between Generation 1 and Generation 2 data flows. So first of all, the solution that you can find Generation 1 and Generation 2 data flows in. So the Gen 1 data flows can be found if you have a Power BI Pro license or higher. So Power BI Premium per user and Power BI capacities all allow you to use Generation 1. If you want to use Gen 2, you have to have a Fabric capacity. So that's an F2 or higher capacity. You may have access to Gen 2 if you had formerly a Power BI Premium capacity, because those are essentially Fabric capacities these days. So a P1 capacity is an F64 Fabric capacity. You just need your Fabric administrator to turn on those capabilities for you. Then the next one is, we've always had the ability to import a new data flow from somebody else's template. So if somebody had created a data flow that you want to start from and make some changes to, they could export their data flow into a JSON file for you, and you could then just import that into Power BI service and it would create a new copy of that data flow for you. So for generation 2 data flows, that's not the JSON file anymore. It has to be something called a Power Query template. And in one of the demos, I'll show you how to export one of those and use that in Gen 2. Then the next one I've already covered. The Gen 1 data flow doesn't write into anything. It's just something you would pull yourself into a semantic model, whereas Gen 2 writes into all those sources I showed on the previous slide. Now, restrictions in development. So with Gen 1, you can create as many queries as you like. Once you get higher than a certain number of queries, you do get a warning to say that there are too many queries and it may cause slow performance and so on and so forth. But actually in Gen 2, they've toughened that up a little bit. And if you've got more than a certain number of queries, something like 50 off the top of my head, you will actually get an error message and it won't let you save the data flow until you've reduced the number of queries. And although that might seem a bit more restrictive, it's a really good thing in my opinion, because I've certainly going to various different clients, I've seen hugely complex data flows which at the end eventually become unserviceable, unmanageable, and it's better to have them limited from day one than allow people to kind of create these Frankenstein's monsters, if you like. Then the next one's kind of invisible to us as end users, so infrastructure. So I know from speaking to Microsoft that Gen 1 data flows are based on older infrastructure, and I wouldn't say vulnerable as such, but it's more vulnerable I think than Gen 2. And I did come across one example where a vulnerability on the Microsoft side in terms of performance actually caused a capacity issue. So whilst our data flow was waiting for Microsoft capacity to do what it should be doing, it was actually showing as running on our capacity and burnt through our available capacity and caused some throttling in fact. So the Microsoft suggestion was to move from Gen 1 to Gen 2 to solve that problem. And that brings me actually to the final point, deployment pipelines. Although in that customer I would have loved to move to Gen 2, unfortunately that customer is a heavy user of deployment pipelines, meaning the dev, test, production capabilities, where you can protect the content you've got in production whilst you're working on changes to it. That's really important to that client, and unfortunately at the moment Gen 2 data flows are not supported in deployment pipelines. So actually that issue that Microsoft recommended that we move from Gen 1 to Gen 2 for, we're unable to do that at the moment until that comes into the roadmap. I have no doubt it will come, but it isn't there right now. Okay, so here we are in a blank Power BI workspace and we're going to do a few demos. So the first thing we're going to do is create an old Gen 1 data flow. And for that, we're going to go to defining some new tables. And we're just going to choose the web API. I'm going to paste in the URL of a file I have on OneDrive. Click next. And we're going to get a table of data from an Excel file into a data flow. So I'm going to click yes to that and transform the data. Quickly promote the first row as headers because I know that those were not headers at the time, and then I'm going to click on save and close. So there's our Gen 1 data flow, and we're just going to call it line managers. Go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to hit refresh now so it has some data in it. And I could just now go ahead and open Power BI Desktop and just grab that data from the data flow. So just go to get data, data flows, and just pull that in. And that's actually the only way I can consume that data, is to bring it into a semantic model either in desktop or here in the Power BI service. So then if I go back to my workspace now, there's our Gen 1 data flow sat there. And if I try to click on the three dots, one of the options I have here is to export a JSON file, and exporting the JSON file will allow me to actually go ahead and create another copy of that data flow as a starting point for another one if I want to. So I can come in here and say new item, data flow, and this time I can say I want to import a model rather than create one, and I can just select that JSON file and click open, and it's going to go ahead and create that new Gen 1 data flow for me. So one of the things that's different with Gen 2 is you can't do it exactly like that. So the Gen 2 data flow, when I click on new item, it's going to ask for a different type of file for it to import the data flow and create a new one, and that file is a Power Query template. So to get to that, we have to come back into the data flow, we have to click export template, and then we have to go ahead and just give that template a name. So let's just say line manager. Now you can only do that if you own the data flow, because if you come in here, if you get this far, you've actually taken over the data flow at this point, and that means that you will have cleared the credentials that the person has used when they were creating the original data flow. So what I quite often end up doing if somebody else owns a data flow is I find myself exporting a JSON here, creating another generation 1 data flow in my name in another workspace, and then going into that version of the data flow to get my Power Query template. If I'm trying to migrate from Gen 1 to Gen 2, I have to go through those steps. So let's just quickly finish off that demo so that you know how to do that for yourselves. So this time we're going to say new and Gen 2 data flow, and you can see actually it immediately creates a couple of other objects, not just the data flow itself, but we'll come back to that in a minute. And then here we have import from a Power Query template. So it's if I click on this one, this is where that PQT file becomes useful. So there's my line manager PQT file. If I click open, it's going to create that in Power in my my new data flow. So I just need to give it the credentials, and it will go ahead and bring in the data just like with the previous one, and all the previous applied steps are there. So now when I publish that data flow, we get a slightly different experience. First of all, it doesn't ask for the name. The name stays as Dataflow 1 for the time being. Secondly, it doesn't show all the publishing dialog up here. It shows the spinning wheel here saying publish in progress, and then it will actually automatically kick off the refresh straight after this as well. So all of those things happen in a slightly different way to the original Dataflows Gen 1 ways of working. So now we see the Dataflows published successfully, and you can see automatically the refresh started to run as well. Another thing to note is that whilst that refresh is running, I actually can't edit the data flow. So when I click that, nothing happens. When I click on the 3 dots, the edit is hidden as well. So I do have to be patient and wait for the refresh to finish before I could go in and do anything else with that data flow. Okay, so our refresh is finished, and I can now go in and rename it. So I could just click up here and say I want to call this Line Managers Gen 2 and click publish again. So now the data flow is going to republish again and then refresh again. Now whilst we're waiting for it to do that, we're going to move on to the next part of our demo, where we're going to want to save the data for the Dataflow Gen 2 into a lakehouse. In this example, I could create a warehouse or something else, but for this one I'm going to create a lakehouse. So we're going to say new item, and this time we're going to scroll down and look for lakehouse. So there's our lakehouse over there in store data. We're going to call this Gen 2 demo. No spaces allowed in lakehouse names, hence the underscores. I'm going to click create, and you'll see our lakehouse comes in and gets created. It's an empty lakehouse, space for tables, space for files, and I could actually create my new Gen 2 data flow directly from here if I wanted to. And if I did that, it would automatically write into this lakehouse. So it's a good practice actually to do that from there. Anyway, let's go back into here for now. So our data flow's still refreshing, so we can't edit it just yet. We have to be patient and wait for that to finish. And there we go, it's just finished now. So we're going to go into our data flow again, and now we're going to define a destination for the data to land in. So we can do it up here, or we can do it down here for this particular query. So I'm going to click on Lakehouse and next. And we are now going to find our Gen 1 versus Gen 2 demos. and we're going to select our Gen 2 demo lakehouse, and you can see the next button lights up for us, and it's going to write our new table in called line managers. Now you notice it's changed the name very slightly, put an underscore in. That's just because in lakehouses we're not allowed to have spaces. It also automatically determines the type of column it's going to create in the lakehouse, and if we want we can untick this and make changes here if we wish. But for now I'm just going to save settings, and we're going to publish, and once again we're going to see this data flow publish, and then we're going to see it refresh, and only once that's finished will we actually see the data land in our lakehouse. So just whilst it's doing that, I'm going to talk about a couple of background things going on. So when I first created the data flow, you might have seen that we had a SQL Analytics endpoint and a lakehouse created. Actually, that's just an indicator of the way this whole structure works in the Microsoft world. So I don't know the full ins and outs of it, but I know that these data flows are very closely tied to lakehouses, and they actually create their own lakehouse effectively in the background, but we just don't see it these days. You did originally see it back in May 23 when Fabric was released. So you can see the publish has finished, and we're now just waiting for that refresh to run, and once that's run we'll be able to pop into our lakehouse and see if we can see that data in a table. Okay, so our refresh is finished, and we're going to pop into our lakehouse now, and we can't see anything initially, but we just need to hit refresh, and there we go. We have our line managers delta table now here in our lakehouse, and it's just loading a preview of that for us. So we could now combine that with other data here in the lakehouse, and then we could create a brand new notebook on top of this that would then start manipulating that data in some way. So all the capabilities we could need are there. So the next thing we're just going to demonstrate quickly is deployment pipeline. So I'm going to click on create deployment pipeline. I'm just going to call this Gen 2 and click next, and I'm going to go ahead and assign I'm going to select first of all that I want these three different parts of the pipeline. I'm going to click create and continue. It's now going to ask me which workspace I want to assign. It's going to be this one, of course, and then I'm going to click the tick, and straight away you can see, as I said in my slides, unfortunately our Gen 2 data flow is unsupported. If I go ahead and select all these items now, I can deploy them to the next stage, and you can see it doesn't list, unfortunately, our Gen 2 data flow. It's not going to be deployed. So when I click deploy, we can now see this deployment process going on, deploying from development into test. Okay, so there we go. Our deployment's finished now, and we can see all the items that are in there. So interestingly, the Dataflow staging lakehouse and Dataflow staging warehouse, the things that are created in the background do all appear, and you can see our lakehouse appears okay, but the actual data flow itself doesn't make it across. There's our original data flow, but we don't see our Gen 2 data flow, unfortunately. So that's the last of the limitations that I wanted to show in this demo. So I guess all I would say is I think Gen 2 data flows are going to be the way forward. We're clearly going to find ourselves moving, I think, from Gen 1 to Gen 2 using the Power Query templates. I'm definitely looking forward to them resolving the issue with moving from dev to test to production, because I think most organizations do that if they have any kind of scale going on, and so it will be really tough to move away from Gen 1 whilst that issue persists. So I look forward to that being resolved by Microsoft. But I hope this video was helpful for you guys to understand those key differences between Gen 1 and Gen 2, and happy playing with those Gen 2 data flows in the future. Thank you. Bye.